Los Angeles, 1956. The conference room at Fox smelled like cigarettes and expensive cologne. Marilyn sat at the long table between her lawyer and her acting coach, watching a director she'd worked with twice before leaned back in his chair like he owned the building. He was there to pitch her next picture, but something in his tone had already shifted. The meeting wasn't 5 minutes old when he said it, casual as ordering lunch, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Look, sweetheart, we all know what you bring to the table. You're not here to play Ibsen. You're here because you're easy on the eyes. These are the stories Hollywood kept quiet, the moments that never made it to press. If you want to hear what really happened behind the rehearsals, the contracts, and the closed doors, subscribe. Not everyone will understand why these matter." The room didn't react. Not at first. Her lawyer glanced down at his notes. Her coach shifted in her seat but said nothing. The executives at the far end of the table continued flipping through the script pages. It was the kind of comment that happened all the time in rooms like this, the kind that men with power made because they could, because no one ever stopped them, because Marilyn Monroe was supposed to smile and take it. She had before. Everyone assumed she would again. The director was still smiling. That was the part that stung most. He wasn't embarrassed by what he'd said. He wasn't uncertain. He looked pleased with himself, like he'd made a joke everyone would appreciate, like he'd stated an obvious truth that needed no qualification. His fingers drummed on the script in front of him, relaxed, confident. He glanced at the executives as if expecting them to nod in agreement, to affirm that yes, this was just how things worked. This was business. This was reality. Marilyn didn't move. She sat with her hands folded on the table, her posture perfect, her expression unchanged. She had learned a long time ago how to hold herself still when something inside her wanted to crack. She had learned it in the homes where no one wanted her, in the offices where men decided her worth before she opened her mouth, in the marriages that ended because she wanted more than what was offered. This was not new. What was new was what she chose to do with it. Inside, something was calculating. She could feel the old instinct rising, the one that told her to laugh it off, to make it easier for everyone, to smooth over the discomfort with charm. That instinct had kept her employed for years. It had protected her when she had nothing else. But she had something else now. She had training, she had a new contract. She had spent months in New York proving to herself that she was more than what men like this believed. And she had made a promise to herself that she wouldn't shrink anymore. The director kept talking. He was explaining the role, describing how her character would serve the male lead's journey, how the wardrobe would emphasize her figure, how the lighting would make her look just right. He used the word right 3 times. He smiled when he said it, like he was doing her a favor, like this was generosity, like she should be grateful he was willing to work with someone who only had looks to offer. She let him finish. She didn't interrupt, didn't correct, didn't defend. She waited until he was done, until the room had settled into that expectant silence where someone needed to respond. Her lawyer started to speak, probably to smooth things over, to keep the deal alive, to protect her career. Marilyn touched his arm just lightly and he stopped. She looked at the director, not a glare, not anger, just direct, unblinking attention. "I've spent the last 2 years studying at the actor's studio," she said. Her voice was quiet, steady, and colder than anyone in that room had ever heard from her. "I've worked with Lee Strasberg. I've read Stanislavski. I've spent nights dissecting scenes from Chekhov and O'Neill because I wanted to understand what it means to inhabit a character, not just perform one. I left Hollywood and moved to New York because I was tired of people assuming I had nothing to offer but a smile." She could see him trying to recalibrate. His smile had faded. His posture had changed. He was sitting up straighter now, no longer lounging like this was a formality. There was something in his eyes that looked almost like confusion, as if he couldn't quite reconcile the woman speaking with the woman he thought he knew. She had never talked to him like this before. She had never challenged him. In his mind, she existed in a specific category, and that category didn't include this kind of clarity, this kind of force. The director's expression changed. Not dramatically, just a tightening around the mouth, a flicker of something that might have been surprise or embarrassment. He opened his mouth to respond, but she wasn't done. She leaned forward slightly, still composed, still controlled, but with a weight in her words that made it clear she had decided this moment mattered. "You've directed me twice," she continued. "Both times, you gave me scripts where I played a decoration. Both times, I delivered what you asked for because I was contractually obligated and because I didn't have the power to say no. But I came back to Fox with a new contract, one that gives me script approval, one that lets me choose my directors, one that recognizes I'm more than what you just described." She paused. The silence in the room was absolute. No one coughed. No one shuffled papers. The executives at the end of the table were watching now, fully focused, and her lawyer had stopped pretending to review documents. This wasn't how these meetings went. Stars didn't talk back, especially not stars who looked like Marilyn Monroe, especially not to men who had been in the business for 20 years. "I don't need you to believe I'm capable," Marilyn said. "I need you to respect the fact that I've done the work to prove it. And if you can't do that, then this meeting is over." She stood up. She didn't gather her things in a rush. She didn't storm out. She simply rose from her chair with the same grace she brought to every entrance she'd ever made, and she looked at her lawyer. "We're done here." Her lawyer stood. Her coach stood. They moved toward the door, and for a moment no one else in the room moved at all. The director finally found his voice. "Marilyn, wait. I didn't mean—" But she was already at the door, and she turned back only briefly. "Yes, you did," she said. "That's the problem." Then she left. The hallway outside was long and quiet. Marilyn walked without looking back, her heels clicking on the polished floor, her breathing steady even though her hands were trembling. She had just walked out of $1 million deal. She had just told a powerful director to his face that his opinion didn't matter. She had just done something that could cost her work, cost her reputation, cost her the career she'd fought so hard to build. Her lawyer caught up to her near the elevator. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen," he said, "or the most expensive." Marilyn pressed the button for the ground floor and watched the numbers light up. "It was necessary," she said. "If I keep accepting how they see me, I'll never become who I actually am." The elevator doors opened. She stepped inside. The lawyer and coach followed. No one spoke on the way down. When they reached the lobby, Marilyn paused near the doors. The afternoon light was streaming through the glass, bright and unforgiving. She could see photographers outside, always waiting, always ready to catch her leaving a building or getting into a car. She took a breath, steadied herself, and put on the smile she had perfected over years of practice. Not because she felt like smiling, but because that's what the world outside required. The performance never really ended. It just changed shapes. Back in the conference room, the silence lasted longer than it should have. The director sat frozen in his chair, staring at the empty seat where Marilyn had been. One of the executives cleared his throat. "Well," he said, "that was interesting." Another executive, older, with more years in the business than anyone else at the table, closed his script copy. "She's right, you know," he said quietly. "We've been underestimating her." The director didn't respond. He couldn't. He was still processing what had happened, still trying to reconcile the woman who had just left with the woman he thought he knew. He had directed her in 2 pictures. He had watched her memorize lines, take direction, deliver performances that made audiences fall in love with her. But he had never actually listened to her. He had never considered that she might have ambitions beyond what he imagined for her. The story spread quickly. Not in the press, not in the gossip columns, but in the private conversations that happened between studio heads and agents and directors who were preparing their next films. Word traveled that Marilyn Monroe had walked out of a meeting, that she had demanded respect, that she had made it clear she wouldn't accept being treated as window dressing anymore. Some people were impressed. Some people were irritated, but everyone understood that something had shifted. 3 days later, the director called her agent. He wanted to apologize, he said. He wanted to meet again, to discuss a different project, something more substantial. Her agent relayed the message. Marilyn listened, thought about it, and said no. "He doesn't get to learn respect at my expense," she told him. "If he needs me to walk out of a room to understand I'm serious, then he wasn't listening before. And I don't have time for people who only hear me after I make them uncomfortable." The director never worked with her again. Other directors did. Directors who had heard what happened and saw it as proof that Marilyn Monroe was someone worth taking seriously. Directors who understood that beauty and intelligence weren't mutually exclusive. Directors who gave her roles that asked her to do more than smile and look pretty. The work she did after that moment became some of the most respected of her career, but none of that happened immediately. The days after the meeting, Marilyn went back to her apartment in New York and sat alone in the quiet. She didn't call anyone. She didn't celebrate. She didn't feel victorious. She felt tired of having to prove herself over and over, tired of being underestimated by people who should have known better, tired of fighting for dignity in an industry that preferred her compliant. She stood by her window one evening, looking out at the city lights, and wondered how many other women had been in similar rooms, hearing similar comments, making similar calculations about whether it was worth speaking up. How many had stayed silent because they needed the job, because they had no leverage, because they knew the cost of resistance was too high. She had been one of those women for most of her career. The only difference now was that she had earned enough power to say no. But earning that power had required years of accepting disrespect. She thought about all the times she had stayed silent, all the meetings where men had made comments like that, and she had smiled because it was easier, because she needed the work, because she didn't have the leverage to push back. She thought about the years she had spent being told she was lucky to be beautiful, as if beauty were a substitute for ability, as if it excused people from treating her as a full human being. There was no satisfaction in what she had done, only a quiet, steady certainty that she had made the right choice. She had drawn a line. She had refused to let someone reduce her to a single dimension. She had walked away from money and opportunity because her sense of self was worth more than either. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a scene from a movie. It was just a decision she made in a moment when she could have stayed silent and chose not to. Years later, after she was gone, people who had been in that room still talked about it. Her lawyer included the story in his memoir, though he changed the director's name. Her acting coach mentioned it in an interview, calling it the moment she realized Marilyn had truly committed to being taken seriously. The executives who were there remembered it as the day they understood she wasn't just a star. She was a force. But the director himself never spoke about it publicly. In private, though, according to people who knew him, he admitted it was one of the worst mistakes of his career. Not because he lost a deal, but because he had revealed something about himself he couldn't take back. He had shown his arrogance, his condescension, his inability to see talent when it didn't fit his expectations. And Marilyn had held up a mirror to all of it without raising her voice. The truth is, most people in Hollywood didn't change because of what happened in that room. Most directors still saw actresses as accessories. Most studios still prioritized appearance over ability. Most contracts still favored the men who made the decisions. But a few people, the ones who were paying attention, started to recognize that Marilyn Monroe was something different. She wasn't just beautiful. She was deliberate. She was strategic. She was willing to sacrifice opportunity for self-respect. And that terrified some people. Because if Marilyn Monroe, the most famous woman in the world, could walk away from a deal because someone disrespected her, then maybe other actresses could too. Maybe the whole system of casual cruelty and unchallenged power could be questioned. Maybe the way things had always been done wasn't the way they had to stay. That possibility, more than anything, was what made that moment matter. Marilyn never regretted it. She told her coach once, months later, that walking out of that room was one of the most important things she'd ever done. Not because it changed Hollywood. It didn't. But because it changed how she saw herself. She had spent so much of her life absorbing other people's opinions, letting them define her, shrinking herself to fit their expectations. In that moment, she had refused. She had stood up, spoken clearly, and left. And no one could take that from her. The director died in the 1980s. His obituary mentioned his long career, his successful films, his contributions to the industry. It did not mention that he once dismissed Marilyn Monroe as just a pretty face. It did not mention that she responded by proving him wrong without ever needing to say another word. Those details were left out, the way so many details about women's resistance were left out of the official record. But the people who were there remembered. And Marilyn, who died far too young, who never got to see how much her work would be reevaluated and respected in later decades, who never got to hear the apologies that should have come while she was alive. Marilyn left behind more than films. She left behind moments like this one, Moments where she chose herself. Moments where she refused to be diminished. Moments where she demonstrated that strength doesn't always look like defiance. Sometimes it looks like a woman standing up from a table and walking out the door. The conference room at Fox is gone now. The building was remodeled decades ago. The table where that meeting happened was probably thrown out or sold or forgotten. But the moment itself remains, passed along in stories, in memories, in the quiet knowledge that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to participate in your own diminishment. Marilyn understood that. She lived it. And in doing so, she left a lesson that outlasted every insult, every dismissal, every person who tried to make her smaller than she was. Because in the end, the director was wrong. Marilyn Monroe was never just a pretty face. She was a woman who knew her worth, who fought for her dignity, and who understood that walking away from disrespect was not weakness. It was the only choice that let her keep moving forward. And that truth, quiet and unshakable, is what made that room go silent. Not her beauty, not her fame, but her refusal to accept anything less than what she deserved. The story belongs to no one now. The people who were there are gone. The room is gone. Even the studio, in its original form, has been transformed beyond recognition. But the moment itself remains, preserved in the memories that were passed down, in the lesson it contained. That sometimes the most important thing you can do is know when to leave. That dignity is not something anyone can give you or take away. It's something you carry with you, protected or surrendered by your own choices. Marilyn understood that, and in understanding it, she became more than what anyone expected. She became herself.